Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Boothman-Shepard. I am dialing into you from Bali, Indonesia for the UN Risk Reduction Conference's 2022 Global Platform. AECOM and our partner, the University of Hawaii, have an outstanding opportunity to present a 4-day innovation platform as part of the program. Our area of focus is remote island risk reduction with a focus on governance, risk communications, and engaging community to leave no one behind. This session for the innovation platform is focused on risk communication strategies to leave no one behind, and I look forward to sharing a conversation with you over the next few minutes. In the way that community life reflects an interconnected web of relationships, so too should risk communications between governments, among community members, in the workplace, in schools, in cultural institutions and tribal institutions, everywhere where people interact with one another and places in the community. Risk communication should be ever present, and risk awareness and planning needs to become more integrated into our daily lives. This is particularly important in remote island communities where we're seeing increased frequency and exposure to risks and hazards from extreme weather and from climate threats. So whole community risk awareness to leave no one behind is being presented in a web, in a honeycomb of the different dimensions where we live our daily lives. This slide deck is available to you either on the UN Events Hop-In platform, where it will be broadcast remotely, and also on the Linktree site associated with our innovation platform. So whole community risk assessment and awareness is focused on a number of spheres. Today I'm going to talk to you about home life, faith, tribal, and cultural gatherings, government services, non-governmental organizations and the media, schools, healthcare and institutions, workplaces, tourist and traveler education to make up the fabric of community life and risk communications. So for home life, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to promote readiness within the household. And that household might be defined by a small nuclear family, an extended family living together, or a tribal community living in a cooperative environment. So irrespective of how home is defined, that is the place where readiness planning needs to begin. So planning includes awareness about disaster hazards and hazardous conditions, identifying assembly areas or rally places for where community members or household members will gather if there is a shock, plans and the assembly of goods to safely shelter at home or evacuate, and provide information and direction about when the household will be sheltering in place or evacuating and where that evacuation route and location or locations will be based on the hazards. And clearly defined primary and secondary roles and responsibilities in the household to support safety and readiness in preparing for an event, during an event, and in the immediate after effects of the event. So I'm going to give you case examples throughout our conversation today. And so I'm going to give you one from my household. It's very hard in our day-to-day lives to stop everything and focus on risk communications within the household unit. And so I rely on a regular schedule to be a marker on the calendar for when we do that, so that at different intervals throughout the year, my household, which is very small, and I look at our risk planning, our readiness, we review our supplies, change batteries and smoke detectors, look at insurance and other instruments we have to help us stay safe. And we use the June 1st marker for the Atlantic hurricane season for us to plan for tropical threats, all kinds of flooding, including riverine and significant rain events and high wind events. And then we use October 15th as the Great Shakeout Day to practice our seismic and tsunami planning and readiness. We live in the Azores, Portugal, which is part of volcanic archipelago of 9 islands that's part of Portugal. And so we have a number of hazards. Increasingly, we have exposure to hurricanes, which are relatively new to the area. We have gale force winds and hurricane force winds on a regular basis in the winter months on the north coast of the island where we live. And seismic threats and associated consequences, including landslides, slip and slope failures, and tsunamis, are an active part of our risk portfolio, in addition to everyday hazards like fires and accidents. I want to talk to you now about opportunities for risk communication with faith, tribal, and cultural resources and gathering spaces. Risk communications are really well suited to these environments because they're places of trust. They're places where older members of the community who are well experienced have a multi-generational understanding of disaster impacts and hazards, and can talk about strategies that have been effective and lessons learned in responding to events. It is a place where there's deep knowledge among community members about one another, and that specialized knowledge is important for one another to come together in a helping situation to meet one another's needs before, during, and after an event. Leaders have community trust, and often when the community gathers, there are times for reflection, for asking for protection, for demonstrating gratitude for safety, and those messages can be clearly linked to specific risk hazards and communication. So if I am in a faith community and we are praying for protection, we can specifically pray for protection from the hazards that we face. And where I live, that's seismic hazards, it's tsunamis, it's hurricanes, it's landslides. Those are the primary hazards that we're exposed to where I live. And so they should be specific to senses of places in those communities. What's also exciting about those places is that it's not reliant only on oration, although that is often a very central part of the tradition in tribal, faith, and other cultural communities. But expressions are made through spoken word, through dance, through song, and through reflection, all of which speak to different learning styles and help people take in messages in a way that's different than someone just speaking to them or someone asking them in a literate environment for people to read communication messages. And it also creates an environment where people can think about one another's safety in a consoling way, in a loving way, in a supportive way. We also know that where there are strong social fabrics and community networks, such as faith, tribal, and other community gathering or cultural gathering places and communities, that those communities do better in responding to immediate post-disaster conditions with regard to life-saving, with regard to safety, and with regard to getting the community habitable again after a major shock. So I'm going to give you a quick example. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria in the U.S. Virgin Islands, communications powered through cell towers and electricity for hard lines failed. And so people gathered in the places where faith communities gathered, whether the facility, whether it was a church, a synagogue, a chapel, another community space was damaged or not, people found their way to that heartbeat of their community. And in that environment, faith community members gathered and agreed to share disaster resource information and post-disaster rapid response, specifically for home repair, as part of the gathering of faith. And so time was created after formal services, in this case in the U.S. Virgin Islands, for people to come together in an ecumenical environment and to share over coffee information, reliable information about how to access disaster repairs for their homes. A quarter of the population had significant damages to their homes, and that was a similar rate among renters and homeowners. So we were really grateful that the faith community was instrumental in facilitating understanding and trust with regard to available resources. So I want to also talk to you about risk communication strategies for government, non-governmental organizations, and the media. Government services in the form of public signage is absolutely essential and really underrepresented. I think we're seeing a great increase in tsunami risk evacuation zones, indications to people to seek high ground in the case of tsunamis. I'm really pleased that the UN and a number of global disaster organizations and national disaster organizations, as well as local entities, have been critical in promoting that, but more can be done. And in particular, the academic community often holds a lot of information about risk hazards in a community, in a sense of place. What are the hazards? How severe could they be? Where will they happen? When might they be anticipated? And what are the damages that they might impact with regard to the community and in consideration of consequences? So it's absolutely important that we get a little bit more connected and create a sense of visual place about the hazards that we have in our community. And so I want to ask you to evaluate how effective the signage is in your community about threats and hazards. So I'd like you to talk to 8 people in your household, in your community, in the places where you live and work, and ask them, based on the signage that they see, can they describe to you the hazards that they face and the direction that is coming from emergency managers or civil protection agencies to help life safety, essentially. So gather some answers and do a gap analysis and compare what is generally known in your small group with what is generally understood to be the hazards that you face as a community, and close the gap by working with government organizations to promote a high rate of signage, whether it's slope failures, hurricane zones, landslides, flash flood areas, tornado zones, all the hazards that threaten us. And also begin to have the conversation about the more nuanced conversation about increased stresses from sea level rise and other climate threats, the impacts of drought, the impacts of massive rainfall events, the impacts of sea level rise, all are particularly important in remote communities, and in particular remote island communities. So it's essential that we begin to unpack that conversation and figure out strategies how to translate something that's very nuanced into something that can be clearly and easily understood by the community. The way we do that is to have the conversation with community. So, right, first and always, it's not just about those of us who identify as community emergency managers to come together, but for us to meaningfully consult so that the ways in which we are communicating with the community comes from them. So I want to talk to you about NGO-supported risk communications at community-based events. Pop-up events at community celebrations, milestones, whether it is a parade, a festival, a gathering of culture and music and food and song. All of these places are ideal for people to be relaxed, to have time, to ask questions in a safe environment that doesn't feel like it's threatening. To be able to communicate risk hazards and information, and to help attendees who come to these events really understand how to put together a plan. What goes into your household readiness plan, for example? That's it. That information is not, naturally understood. So helping people figure out how to define what hazards they face, what they're going to do about it in terms of getting ready, where they're going to go after an event, and how they need to protect themselves during the shock hazard is all critically important. So engage the social sector in supporting key messaging on risk communications. I also want to talk to you about the media. It seems obvious, but sometimes we only leave it to the media to communicate risks and hazards immediately before a known hazard, or when an event is happening or in its immediate wake. And sometimes that information can be skewed, it can be amplified, it can invoke fear. None of those things help people really listen to risk communications to promote safety and wellness. So I want to really encourage you to develop a strong relationship with media, whether it's print media, whether it's radio communication, whether it's news stations or direct communication that's available to you now through blogs, through podcasts, through webinars, where you can communicate directly with your constituents on risk hazards and communications. So I want to share a best practice with you. Emergency managers and elected officials can get on a regular schedule with members of the media to identify warnings, to be interviewed, to share risk hazard information. They can provide shorts that can be short and easily integrated into media programming that otherwise would be an empty space, a void, or essentially an opportunity cost to be silent on risk communications. So get out there and create those opportunities, issue press releases, but don't only step into your relationship with the media when there's an event. Have communications on a regular basis so people come to understand the hazards that they face every day and understand the ways in which they can protect themselves and work as community change agents to transform the risk environment for everyone. So I also want to talk to you about post-shock multi-format news media. So I want to give you a scenario. Following Hurricane Katrina, when it made landfall in Mississippi, there was a 34-foot peak storm surge, and it damaged cell towers, it damaged landlines, utilities were out, pardon the competing noise. The utility systems were unavailable, which meant that risk hazard communication to help people understand how to safely take shelter, how to avoid hazards like live wires, where to get food and water, and how to cope with the immediate impacts of the very devastating effects of Katrina on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, relied on ham radio operators. Many were retired and were still hobbyist ham radio operators, and they were absolutely instrumental in informing the community and getting to the airwaves messages that people could access that helped them take life-saving decisions or make life-saving decisions in their households and access resources that were being made available at the local, state, and federal government levels. Another example is similarly, with television, internet, and mobile communications disrupted post-shock following Hurricanes Irma and Maria throughout the Caribbean, local radio provided essential communication and resources to community members. Not only were they a source of reliable risk information and resources, but they were also a consoling voice, an empathetic voice, and they provided at times really much needed levity to help people cope with the aftermath of disaster. I also want to turn your attention, of course, to social media. We talk about it a lot, but it's still an underrepresented form of regular risk communication by civil protection and emergency managers, community-based organizations, and all entities that have a stake in community safety and risk communications. And I'm looking at a great tweet here, which is on the slide deck that you can access either on Hopin or through the Linktree platform made available for the Innovation Forum. And one of the things that we see here is not just I'm looking at a flood hazard advisory that's tagged to the Turnaround Don't Drown platform. And the flood advisory information shows a map. It provides locations and severity of possible flooding, and it provides direction, what to do in the event of flood, at the surface level. And so what was really exciting about that was that it told people not only what the hazard was and how severe it would be in ground truth, what otherwise might be available or not making it out into the media. So it was a controlled message, but it gave people so what do I do about it? Decision-making power, which is absolutely critical. I'd also encourage you, this was a great tweet, but it got 3 likes and it was retweeted 3 times. And we don't know what kind of traction it got with the retweets, but it's concerning that it only got a few likes because it's so important. And so getting your follower base in social media and getting those numbers up is something that should be mission critical and central to your risk communication strategy at the government level. And I would encourage you to do things like obviously use hashtags to get broader visibility about your message, but also co-sponsor with organizations that have a high degree of social media following and popularity in the community, that are trusted, valued, and important institutions. So whether we're talking about a football team and it's American football or it's a football team and we're talking about football in the rest of the world, those are good entities, for example, to team with because people really tune into those messages. And so you can benefit from their audience to share reliable risk communication messages. And don't forget to monitor Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and other social media vehicles to evaluate when misinformation is being communicated. You have a real opportunity to ground truth, to reset, to provide accurate hazard information in an environment where people post whatever they want. And so I not only encourage you to be offensive in creating a good information platform, but be defensive by surveying information that's available in social media and making sure it works for you and that it's reliable. I want to talk to you now about risk communication in schools, healthcare, and institutions. So, these environments can reach community members at scale, particularly in environments in communities that have compulsory school and government-provided healthcare where there are regular intervals to see people, which means that, again, you can schedule risk hazard communication information as part of the operations of those entities. So for schools, I'm looking at a great ASEAN poster that children put together that showed disaster hazards and response information and the community coming together in a tapestry of response and recovery. It's really lovely, and you'll see it if you access the slide deck. But knitting key messages in K through 12 or early childhood, middle, and high school education has been absolutely an instrumental strategy for home and household education and local community information, and to promote and spark those conversations around the dinner table and in the neighborhoods to talk about hazards or whatever issues are being surfaced through the education environment. And so I want to look to service learning pedagogy as a really good practice for us to use as a model for curriculum interventions for students, where students can learn the science of hazards as part of their academic curriculum. They can consider consequences as part of their academic curriculum. They can begin to ideate and plan on risk communications, just like this poster contest reflects, and also begin to be part of developing solutions and activating children as change agents within the community to transform risk conditions. And so there are a number of ways that you can do that. Curriculum integration, as I said, gamification, and other methods are all available to you when working in close coordination with school districts, public and private school districts, to make sure that people have reliable information and that children are key educators and actors in providing accurate risk messaging for them, for their households, however it's defined, and in the broader community. In healthcare institutions, there is often very good signage in hospitals about what to do and what not to do, whether you need to wear a mask to go in someone's room based on their health hazard or pandemic conditions. And so generally risk communications in hospitals and healthcare environments is really quite good and sophisticated. However, that usually stops at the door when it comes to other hazards and risks. And I would encourage you to work with health providing institutions, hospitals, community-based healthcare providers to make sure that everyone who comes through the door has at least a little bit of information about the hazards they face, how to access information and direction on risk hazards, and are having conversations, again, with trusted healthcare providers. Questions that people might be uncomfortable or embarrassed to ask. Also, people with chronic and other health conditions really have an important responsibility to talk to their healthcare providers about what special accommodations that they need. So people on kidney dialysis, people who use oxygen, people who use other assistive devices for mobility, all have unique responsibilities and burdens to navigate if there is a shock. Another example are people who are diabetic and insulin dependent. Insulin must be refrigerated. And so when that refrigeration is unavailable, and it inhibits people who are insulin dependent from receiving the care that they need, or self-administering even the care that they need. So please key into the institutions and also the special health conditions that require additional planning for people to remain safe in hazards. I also want to talk to you about care institutions that support vulnerable populations, whether it is child's protective services, orphanages, child care centers, elder care centers, prisons, halfway houses, homeless shelters. All of these environments have people in the care of those environments that have unique needs, and for whom risk communication messages that are out in the public domain simply may not get to, or may not be understood or accessible. In addition, those individuals might require support in order to respond to direction from emergency managers and civil protection to take life-saving action. And so plans by those institutions in coordination with government that are updated, that are exercised, that are clearly understood is absolutely essential in a civil society that cares for everyone. So let's talk about the workplace. The workplace provides an incredible environment for people to meet people where they're at, whether someone is a construction worker or they work in food service, they work in hospitality, they work in housekeeping, they are professionals. No matter who is engaged in the work and workplaces, and no matter what forms those workplaces take, whether it's on the street, in a small shop, in someone's car, working remotely for some people in pandemic conditions, all of those environments have one thing in common, and that is that there is regular contact with a supervisory or oversight structure of the employer that provides the opportunity to communicate risks and hazards and reinforce messaging for how people can protect themselves. You know, certainly in the workplace, people need to know what hazards are different or unique. We do a really good job when people are exposed to hazardous materials, and we have a great deal of international safety standards that help protect people. And so we need to be thinking about risk hazard communication in that way. Certainly through the coronavirus pandemic, we have become a lot smarter about workplace hazard communication. And while we haven't always been successful in reducing transmission in the workplace to the extent to which we would like, we have seen safe behaviors communicated much more consistently, much more effectively through policies, procedures, programming, and information. So I'm excited that we have learned how to do that, and now we need to expand the aperture beyond pandemic conditions to focus on other hazards that people face at work every day. So risk communications also for people who come into communities. And since we're focused on remote island environments and the special risks and hazards that are faced in these environments, tourism and traveler education is absolutely essential, because it's often a critical part of the economy, but also means that there are a disproportionately high number of people in tourism dependent environments, of individuals that need help, of individuals that are not aware of hazards that are in the community, that don't have any familiarity with them, that don't know how to take care of themselves, that don't know how to seek assistance after an event, who often don't speak the primary language in the community that's being visited. There are also students who are visiting a region on long-term arrangements who sometimes are a little bit disconnected, again, due to language and other reasons, just are not connected to key community messages. They're not integrated into the culture yet. So it's really important that we do a good job at making sure that tourists understand their own responsibilities in preparing for hazards, and having hazard awareness, and knowing what to do, whether it's drop, cover and hold under this desk, for example, in an earthquake, evacuating to higher ground in a tsunami, leaving if there is a tropical storm, hurricane or cyclone forecast for the area, connecting with embassies and consulates before or after disaster impacts, and essentially not being a burden on the community when recovery conditions need to initiate. And so it takes a lot of effort for the reimagination of risk communication of this particular audience, but it's really important that we help people get out of a hazard if it's a known hazard that is coming, or for an immediate shock hazard, for people to know what to do, where they should stay, and how to get back to their home environment whenever that's feasible. So that concludes my discussion with you on risk communications, planning ahead to leave no one behind. In summary, I want to remind you that we want to identify the way people live, work, communicate, and get together as a community, and make sure that our risk hazard communications are part of the fabric of what we do every single day, to make sure that our places have really good information about hazards, severity, locations, and instructions on what to do if those hazards are faced, that we have clear direction and we create opportunities and intervals at home, at work, in the community, in our tribal and faith-based communities and other environments where we gather to understand hazard information, make informed decisions, help one another, encourage one another, console one another, and support one another before, during, and after a shock. I wish you safety and well, and really appreciate that you took the opportunity to sit with me to discuss risk communications. Thanks very much.